In the days of university, this is Loughborough University where I studied, I would have loved to know these 5 things that I'm going to share with you in this video. If you're watching live, welcome. Tonight is going to be an experimental stream. It's more like a lecture format where I'm going to be talking how things work in terms of chaotic balance, creativity, and even I'm going to talk a little bit about conflicts. So this stream is mainly focusing on sharing content and research, but I'll be prompting at different moments some questions, some things for you to reflect on, as I'm assuming a lot of you watching are actually experts. So here's, as we go along, a little prompt that you'll see popping up in yellow like this, a little check-in for today. Which country are you from? If you're watching this, it'd be nice to hear. I know that we have a lot of people at the moment in Asia and Italy that are following what we do. Today's topic is going to be around the periodic table. So we're going to take every single week an element from the periodic table and zoom into it with a little bit of either tips or practical learnings or examples from the world. And tonight, because it's quite an abstract topic, it's from the bottom of the periodic table, which are the mental models, the think and understand. We're going to be looking at the lens of chaotic, which is something that very few people are surprisingly have heard about. Often people think chaotic, they think chaos theory. Actually, it's just simply the idea of balancing chaos and order with the metaphor of the iceberg, where one is visible and the other part is invisible. So if we look at this chaotic balance element, which we are opening up today, if we simplify this down to an example of front stage and backstage in a shopping center, like you have the front stage, which is what people see when they are going, for example, to a web shop or a physical retail space or in a meeting. That's what is happening in the meeting. That is what you see if you jump into the meeting. And then the backstage is really the process, the invisible part of the iceberg, if you like, that people don't often focus on unless they're process oriented, like the staff in a shop. They might know that there is some back-end things to make sure the supplies are arriving and so on. And in conversations, it's very much the same. It's like you have the front stage, which is really the topic of the conversation. If you were to record most conversations, it's relatively chaotic, actually. And then there's the invisible structure, which is more or less organized. Now, why does this matter? If I just do a little doodle here, I've done a previous video with this explained more specifically, but I'm just going to do a quick theoretical recap of chaotic balance. If you think of a group of people, they are actually in 4 possible states. The first state is a state of chaos. In actual fact, we could call it karmos because it's the destructive chaos. So a group could be in karmos, a group could be in, let's say, chaos. A group could be in a state of order. I'm taking the metaphor of water in nature. So you start to see this is explosive and vapor. This is vapor too. And then this starts to become liquid. And then when you crystallize into a ice lump kind of metaphor, you have control. And in a social setting, that would be quite different. Even though on the surface, you might not notice very much in a meeting, you can have a control excess or a chaos karmos excess in a meeting. Now, in both cases, if you have too much of either one, the group basically disintegrates and is no longer functioning well. So if you have too much control, the group implodes. So it just collapses on itself, and just people are, if they have to stay, they get really disconnected and bored and multitask on their phones. And in the other end, if you have too much chaos, you have a destruction by explosion. So that's when people just walk away, not really interested in the meeting, probably even in conflict. So that's really the states. And obviously you want to be in the middle somewhere, and finding the chaotic balance, we could say, is about balancing chaos and order. And there's usually 2 ways you can do that. There's what they call the chaotic path, which is the mixture of chaos and order, not surprisingly. And then there is the order control path, which is more for predictable outcomes. Now, today we're talking about creativity. So we're focusing on the chaotic path, which really has two key points. When you balance chaos and order, you get creativity, you get fresh thinking for problem solving. So problem solving is often underlooked as related to creativity. But if you're using creative thinking to solve problems, you're going to find some really interesting workarounds and solutions. And companies like IDEO sell that as a process of creative problem solving. Designers specialized in that. So chaotic balance is what we're looking at now. How to do that? If we go back to the metaphor of the iceberg, there's the top here is the front stage, and the bottom here is the backstage. Now, backstage is where you have the process, and front stage is where you have the content of a conversation. So what happens, and we're talking about blind spots today, the blind spot is all under the surface here. Essentially, if you look into work by D. Hock, Chaordic, The Birth of the Chaotic Age, there's one great book for your library, D. Hock. There's lots of other things about this, but it's not a very commonly talked about topic. The chaotic balance is the idea of finding the balance between chaos and order. How do you do that? Is really, there's a little secret unlocking, which is that the more you bring order and control to the bottom of the iceberg, in other words, your purpose, the process is driven by a purpose. Why are we meeting together? It's because we have a common purpose, or community, or business is a mission. Process, there's a common process. Like we have defined in a shop, the process of serving a customer. Well, in a conversation, what is the process of communicating? Is it entirely chaotic? Rules. What are the rules of conversation? Again, where are those rules? Who's setting them, and who knows about them, and who's even applying them? And then there's roles. So those are the key kind of building blocks of a chaotic balance. Is the more you lock down and control roles, rules, process, and purpose, the more you can let creative problem solving emerge in the content of conversations. Now, what that means in practice, I'm going to show you with a couple of examples. In a sense, if you have a process of conversation, then it doesn't really matter what it is, as long as it's clear for everybody and it's structured. What happens often is that there's too much chaos in those moments of conversation. So it's a cultural thing. Somebody who talks a lot, who's extrovert, might talk, and then it creates more chaos, and so on and so on. So the cultural preferences then prime. If there is no chaotic purpose, process, rules, and roles, then really you can expect a meeting to be late. You can expect it to be a waste of time and usually not tap into collective intelligence. So let's have a look now at a couple of practicals about this. First question is, first research question. Notice the sound jingles. If it's too loud, let me know in the comments, because I'm just still prototyping and testing how to do this. First question for you, whether you're in live or whether you are in the replay in YouTube, what do you usually write in the description when you invite people to meetings? This is the first blind spot. What do you usually write in the description when you invite people to meetings? Now, that is something that most people think of as, oh, well, if they've been watching Simon Sinek, they'll be talking about start from why. So some people, I've heard a lot, write why. Why am I invited? So they'll typically write the title of a meeting, and pretty much that's it. Obviously the time, and it looks like this. You have a Google Calendar invite. Okay, so not surprisingly, date, a lot of boxes to fill, but very few people really pay attention to that description, and they think, I don't have time to write a description. People don't have time to read the description. I'll just write a one sentence about perhaps the why, if they've been watching Simon Sinek. Now, there's a blind spot, because what actually happens is that that's an opportunity to save time. If you are thinking of chaotic balance, it's really often to do with wasting time. So what we've been measuring, I'm going to show you some data that we've been gathering It's still a very small sample, but we're looking very deeply at measuring communication behaviors. And in the chaotic lens, this is a measure of overall chaos and order in different types of groups of people. So, you probably can't read this. I'm going to just zoom down so you can see pointer, and you can see that there's like leaders. We're measuring leaders. We're measuring employees, often in creative industry, coaches, people like Scrum Masters who coach people to do better processes in this, and investors in the context of startups and startup founders. Now, when you look at that, it's quite clear that there is, if you look at the score in 8 in the middle, that's how much there is chaos, okay? So there is a lot of chaos. Out of 10, this score is. So when you look at, there's a very similar amount of chaos, but generally speaking, 8 out of 10 is, they would call it freedom, but it's also called chaos in the way you communicate. So very little structure exists. And if I dive into perhaps more relevant, like what are the places where there's the most risk of wasting time with chaos? If these are measured touch points, there's 2 that stand out that are relevant for group dynamics. One is the most chaos is in the rules. Now that means guidelines, templates, procedures, best practices. So in other words, a lot of people don't have very much order in the way they use templates. It's just like haphazard. And the other one that is to do with group dynamics, this is just to do with individual learning, planning, scheduling, organizing, which is calendar invites. So there's a lot of chaos in calendar, which is surprising when you see just how many boxes there are to set up a calendar invite. And that's because there isn't enough process information, chaotic purpose, process, rules, and roles inside this description. Now, there's an art to writing great invitations. There's people whose job it is to invite in meetings. There's a fantastic book called The Art of Hosting Meaningful Conversations, where they talk a lot about the importance and the way of doing a great invitation. What we're going to do is just share that with you in another video where we'll talk more deeply about how to do a templated invitation. I'll basically write a couple of options of templates that we've been using and iterating for years around how to do a chaotic invitation that gets time saved during the meeting. Essentially what it is you have a template of a meeting invitation with clear roles, which I'll tell you more about in a second with what I mean by chaotic roles, some clear rules of conversation. Who's going to make decisions and how? Is that clear in an invitation? Otherwise, they turn up thinking they're just experts. Framing, why are we meeting? And the process, usually a series of steps of how we're going to run the meeting with time buckets that is not content. It's not the questions we're going to ask. It's actually steps in a process like check-in, dialogue, discussion, co-creation, checkout. Those with time buckets. Now, some people do this really, really well in the creative industry. I've seen great examples, but most often that doesn't exist in an invitation. So that's the first blind spot, is invite, because of the actual lack of clarity around the time management with templated roles, rules, framing, process, agenda. Now, the second one we have, the second question, maybe I should check the chat, double check before. Nope, I'm having a bug with the chat. I can't check the chat. So I'm going to have to just pretend that there were no comments in the chat, and I will do the answers in the YouTube in the comments afterwards. Here we have question number 2, is how do you visualize and communicate changes in conversations? Now, I'm just wondering, what is a change in conversation when I read this question? What is a change in conversation? Most people think that conversations are changing all the time. Yes, they are, because they're relatively chaotic. I'm going to take you to an example, which is from IDEO. I used to work there. They have a very interesting creative process, which they've done a lot of publicity around when talking about design thinking and all the process and IDEO use toolkits that's out there. A really great example is how they visualize chaotic processes. I've seen a lot of visualizations for process in groups like Art of Hosting, but very rarely have they been so well designed and clarified as in that. This was a poster that was used in workshop rooms in IDEO back in 2001, so it's probably way out of date. But nevertheless, what was interesting is that it shows a step of process. So it's notice that it doesn't talk about what is the brainstorm question or what are we prototyping. All that's content. It's literally just visualizing the steps. So this is a brilliant example of chaotic mapping of a process. And why does that matter? Because if I go back to the diagram, yes, I have a note to say check chat. I can't see the chat, so I can't answer the chat. But if we look at the chaotic process, there's an entropy. So basically, we are constantly being dragged down towards chaos. You can call that an entropy to chaos. I'll put it in red. So because of that entropy, whatever we do, if we don't do anything, you can expect more chaos. Chaos comes. There's an entropy to chaos. So knowing that, if you're managing a group of people and your intention is to get collective intelligence out, solve problems, use creativity, save time, then you're going to need to do something to counter that entropy, to stop that entropy from happening. And if you gamify this a little bit, instead of making visible just the topic, which is continuously chaotic, and it should be, if you have good chaotic balance, the content of conversations will be chaotic. What you do need to do is bring order by visualizing process so that people can see where they are step by step. So a great example would be just even a 3-step process. First, we're doing a check-in, and then we're going to do a dialogue or a discussion, and then we're going to do a checkout, for example. And that could be just as simple as 10-minute buckets. And you just go, okay, now everybody, we're in the check-in, now we're in the dialogue. And even just writing it down on a flip chart is often enough. But obviously you can do it really nicely, like some in with posters and all that. And that's just to make the visible part of the underneath of the iceberg, which is the process, more visible. Now, another interesting thing, if I go back to the data now, is if we look at, I'm going to go out of this. A great example of doing that is you'll find, and by the way, I'm not paid by Miro to talk about them. And if you're in Miro and you're watching this, you can give me a free account if you want. But this is Miro. Miro is one of the many visual thinking boards. It's a SaaS. It's like Mural and a few others that do great work of making process post-it virtually on. It's like collaboration tools online with virtual post-its. Now, what's really interesting there is that they have already started. I noticed like about a year ago, Miro started templated particular formats of conversation. And what they're doing here is how to actually not just give you a place to put post-its, which is the chaos, but give you step-by-step guidance of how to run certain types of processes and conversations. And the more you look at them, the more they're sort of polishing their templates. We would call those conversation algorithms. In actual fact, you could call it, just a process agenda. It doesn't really matter. It's a bit of a gray area of how you would define this. We've called it right now algorithms because I couldn't think of something more relevant in terms of what's out there in science. But think of it as like a little board of post-its with a direction line. So it just takes you from one to the other when you follow the train track of the process. Now, if you look at Miro, for example, they have tutorials on how to run what I would call chaotic processes. The takeaway from this is, if you don't have one already, because of that blind spot that we don't often visualize the changes in conversations, the easiest way to do that is either to do it on a flip chart or start a library of templated meeting algorithms. For example, you create a Miro board for your Monday morning meeting and a Miro board for your brainstorm with the same process that you just fill with different post-its every time. Very, very simple, one click. You can send it in the invitation and bring a bit more chaotic balance within the invitation. So that's an easy hack. You can do it with flip charts as well, and even just slides. The risk with slides is that people confuse it with the content, and then they create chaos within that, because you can't mix process and content. If you have the content slides with questions and then you have a process slide, then you have to have a really clear visual divider between one and the other. But that is totally possible too. And so we'll be doing a deep dive on how to do a particular type of algorithm, which is so common, called check-ins, checkouts. In fact, next week I'm streaming with some startup founders who are from the gaming industry, and we're gonna actually demonstrate a check-in format, which I really love using, which is like Viking checking, we call it. It's got 3 rounds, and it's such a simple process that you can use it even a sauna conversation in Finland with beers. So it's really easy to use. And now the check-in and check-out process, there's hundreds of ways of doing it. But as long as you have one way that you stick to and that you learn from trial and error how to run it, it will start to become a chaotic process. And I will be doing also a deep dive on how to create canvases. I might even go into Miro and start showing you some of the ones we use, or if you're interested, I can even do a tutorial. If you drop me a link below or the comment below that you're interested, I can actually do a deep dive tutorial on how to use chaotic tools like Miro, Mural, and so on. So this is the second. Blind spot number 3. Which rules do you use in creative or conflictual conversations? Now, rules is a dirty word. Many people really don't like rules. In fact, if anybody's had parent issues with too much rules, they're like, don't want rules, particularly if they're creatives, which is a massive issue, because how do you know when it's not respectful, not effective, not right? If there aren't any rules to break, then basically anything goes. Therefore, chaos primes. And when you're in a creative or conflictual conversation, there is something very difficult about it, which is why, for example, IDEO uses rules for brainstorms. This is a very old card, actually. They have plenty of new versions in the IDEO U, but I like this one because it's really simple. We used to have them as cards in the meeting rooms. Simple: defer judgment, encourage wild ideas, build on the ideas of others, etc. Those are really simple rules. Now, when you don't have them, and you don't have them in the invite, and you don't know them before you turn up, well, what's going to happen when you go to a brainstorm? You're going to start judging. Oh, great idea. Or you'll talk to people and want them to judge your idea, and your ego get a feed from the idea, and all that kills the creativity. So those rules help the creative process because they're chaotic behavioral rules that helps the process to get better. So they're chaotic rules. Now, this is the blind spot here. We have small talk, debate, negotiation, and co-creation. Now, this is a diagram that I've simplified from Otto Scharmer's work. And what's really revealing here is when you start looking at how people's mental model of conversation is, literally, most people have no idea that there are different levels to the collective intelligence. And therefore, there is no knowledge out there about what are the rules that are useful to go to different levels. Now, if we go through small talk, everybody knows that. Weather talk, past oriented talk. So, how are you doing? And you use past conventions and, yeah, great, it's raining in my place and so on. And it's just what you talk from the perspective of what the other one is ready to hear. And it's very polite and often very respectful conversation. And it's great for trust building, but it's just a level 1 conversation. Going deeper into collective intelligence, there is debate and discussion. To go through that, you need a judgment. You need to go through the judgment barrier. And dropping judgment, what Otto Scharmer calls the voice of judgment inside your head. When you drop that judgment, then you unlock a superior collective intelligence through debate and discussion. This is this is where the majority of the world is having what they think are great conversations. The UN is based on that. Scientific thinking is often based on debate and discussion. Now, there's nothing wrong with it, except that it's not as deep as it could be because it's based on right and wrong binary thinking. So there is going to be, limits to what you can do with debate and discussion. Now, what we can do to go deeper is to cross the second barrier, which is the cynicism barrier. Now, that's a harder one. The voice of cynicism is like, nah, I don't really think. You start to sort of sidetrack the thinking of the group by just being cynical about something that you either don't agree with or don't understand or judge in some way negatively. So the judgment then becomes a problem that you have to drop through cynicism, dropping the cynicism away from it. And when you unpeel that, you get to a thinking together, dialogos, thinking across, like in Greek dialogos, as opposed to discussion, which is like more percussion and ideas hitting each other. This is like building together. So it's already more creative. But it's hard to do because the rules are not the same. Notice IDEO's rule, defer judgment, gets you through the judgment barrier, but it doesn't necessarily get through the cynicism barrier. You need another rule, which would be sort of encourage wild ideas, they use. So little rules can help you just cross that barrier in one instant. And then there's the last barrier, the barrier of fear, which is where you just think, oh, I can't do this, we can't do that, the world is not ready, I'm not ready, my team's not ready. Fear. Now, dropping the fear, the voice of fear, opens up and unlocks the deepest level of human intelligence and collective thinking, is co-creation, where you're thinking not just of the present or the past, but you're thinking also of the future. So you're thinking together with a collective mind. Very, very rare. Most people think they're doing that. They actually often not. They're often stuck in either dialogue or discussion. Now, why does it matter? Well, to be able to go through them, you need rules, as we saw with IDEO's example. But if you don't know that there's these levels, you don't know which rules to even start using. So I've seen a lot of people who just recycle rules from other coaches and consultants. I've seen people use IDEO's rules to do all sorts of different things that are not necessarily brainstorms, just because they don't necessarily understand that for different formats, you have different sets of rules. So we started collecting a few years ago, what are the best rules that work at different levels of conversation. I'm just going to show you a few examples. But one thing that really struck me as a sort of blind spot in that area is that values and rules are often disconnected. You have a value, okay, we are honest as a company. What does it mean? We are fair as a company. What does it mean in rules? How do you connect it to a rule? So we started playing with the idea of combining a value and a rule together. We call them value rules. I made them out of wooden, just to show that you can actually keep growing them and evolving them, that these are harvested rules that we found from different companies in different parts of the world that have been reoccurringly coming back in one way or another. So what you see at the top is a value, and at the bottom is a rule that we've seen used with that value. So creativity, often people say, yeah, we're a creative company, we're the best creative company. Okay, well, what does it mean in practice? How do you know that you're being creative in a meeting? The value rule of yes and. Only use yes and, no yes but. You've probably heard this one. It's quite a common one. That's a value rule. Creativity, yes and, no yes but. But you could also use a value rule that we've seen a lot for fairness. How do you make fair decision making in a culture like Sweden, where people are always talking and talking and talking before, and then in another culture where they're arguing, in a third culture where they're silently waiting for a consensus? How on earth do you make a fair decision? Well, you might use a rule like thumbs voting, which is something that you've probably heard about from the Native Americans. They often use this as a way of deciding. It's not that you have up and down like the Roman emperor with gladiators. This is just, I have a proposal on the table. Thumbs up means I support it. Side, I have a question before I can support it. Down, I have a counter proposal that's better for the whole group. Really simple. It would completely change democracy if we used this as a governance method, by the way, particularly if we digitized it and mass sort of expanded it instead of having the yes no of politics. So fairness could be crystallized by a value rule like thumbs voting. We've used this literally for years, and I've seen this in quite a few places work beautifully to make quick decisions across different cultures. Last example, I've got about 12 at the moment that I've built, but I'm not going to show you all of them. Just show you this last one. The value of trust is often super important because most cultures are struggling to build trust across boundaries. So a beautiful one I found from, actually, this was a Native American tribe, the Nuu tribe in British Columbia. They have this permission to ask for help. So the rule is super simple. It's actually very kind and trust building to ask for help. So they would say, because they were on ships going to hunt whales, and if nobody is daring to ask for help when they're in danger, they put the whole boat in danger, right? And then the boat sinks. So it's a form of trust building to be able to be vulnerable and drop your ego and ask for help. And that's a value rule again that any company could just pick up and say, okay, if we think trust matters as a company, our DNA is about trust. Well, what's the value rule? Here's one that you can try. So these are three very simple examples of value rules. The blind spot around here was combining values with a behavior rule so that you can actually make the whole process more clear in terms of what is interacting, how do you interact with each other, and what is okay and not okay. Now, I'm going to go through later some examples of, for example, value rules in small talk, framing, debates, negotiation, co-creation even, and a particularly interesting one, which is marketplaces. I've seen like open space technology uses really great marketplace logic. But more importantly, underneath, if you have any examples of great value rules, do add them in the chat, because it's something that everybody's needing to build up. And very few companies have solid value rules. So it would be great, sort of, for the sake of collective intelligence, to share with each other all our value rules. I can post more, and if you want, I can do a proper full deep dive on the 12 that we've collected so far. The other connected topic is conflicts. A few days ago, I was talking to Maya Fast, who's writing a book on creative processes, and she was asking me about creativity, and we talked about Chaordic naturally. And I think that the blind spot we talked about there was that creativity and conflicts are basically the two sides of the same coin. Often people think of conflict as bad, particularly in the Nordics, but a conflict is a neutral, and it goes bad if it becomes personal, dysfunctional, ego-based, and blaming. It becomes great, and it becomes the source of creativity and attention, fuel for creative thinking, when you can take it away from person and make it around people and process, roles, step away from the ego and talk about it in a very detached way and going, okay, my role needs this. Now, there's a huge blind spot around conflicts, creativity, and rules. Often, when there are no rules, conflicts occur. But yet, the same people who want to avoid having rules are often the people who then end up creating the conflicts. So this is a reflection, actually, that I'm doing out loud for us to even pick up in the chat later, is where you notice people who are resisting rules, you also notice a lot of conflicts. So how might we bring more value rules to avoid dysfunctional conflicts is a great exploration that we're going to be doing in February and March this year. Now, blind spot number 4, before I jump into this one, since Anu is helping me in the chat and that I have a couple of questions, are there anything that you wanted to pick into this so far that I haven't answered, Anu?
Well, Maha was asking about the which startup is going to meet with you, but I lost the context.
Okay. Well, just to answer your question, Maha, we're going to be streaming with Scion Games, and I'll show you at the end. There's a little flash of their website, gaming startup doing educational games. So that's who we're going to be streaming with next week, and we're going to actually demo a Chaordic process together live. So that'll be fun. So the fourth blind spot, let's unpack it here with a question about, again, for you in the chat, if you want to ask out loud some questions about this, or a better question than this, or even think about this question and answer it yourself. Who is hosting in your organizational team the collective intelligence? Because, you go into a group, and if I film meetings, there's a lot of expert intelligence. You have big egos, a lot of chaos, actually. In fact, the most chaos is with the group of coaches who, in a way, if you think about it, they probably should be the one bringing the most order and structure. They're usually the most chaotic. And they are often focusing on trying to get the collective intelligence. But most people come into a meeting thinking, I'm smart, or I'm not smart enough, but I'm an expert, and it's my intelligence that I'm bringing into the group. But who is hosting that collective intelligence? How do you host it, and who's hosting it? That's a question that we've been looking at for a few years, actually. If you've heard about the TEAL organization movement, there's like a lot of different new paradigms around how you organize work. This is an example from the TEAL book by Frédéric Laloux, but you have these different organizational models of how you build yourself into a group of people. TEAL is the latest one that they've uncovered, which looks at nature as a source of inspiration. Now, what happens is that in a group like this, I've been observing groups at work for literally decades, and what happens is that you look at a group, and the more you go into cultures like Scandinavia, which are very flat, very equalitarian cultures, the more there is a blind spot around, I don't want to have a hierarchy. Hierarchy is bad. There's this limiting belief that hierarchy is entirely negative and destructive. So everybody wants to be equal. You look at people, you have no idea who's leading or hosting the conversation, and it goes where it goes. Naturally, what happens? Chaos, entropy. So what that blind spot is about is most likely a risk aversion to, or an old fear that hierarchy in a dominating traditional way, authoritarian way, is obviously not very great for creativity and innovation and culture. But the blind spot is around nature. If you think of nature and you look back at, if everybody was the same, it would be like if you just have this flat lawn of grass. Nature is more like this. The tree doesn't care that it's bigger. It's protecting the smaller branches of the smaller leaves of the other plants underneath. There is natural hierarchy. So what the TEAL organization movement has been talking about, and has been misunderstood in many cultures like Finland actually, is that they're not saying you shouldn't have hierarchy. They're saying you should have natural, organic type hierarchies, which nobody really knows what it means until you look at chaotic in practice. It could look like this. So regardless of your role, expertise. So most people think of their role as being their LinkedIn profile, their expertise. That's nothing to do. That's the content role. That can be as chaotic as you want. Your seniority, again, is just chaos. What's really important for collective intelligence is what of these four roles are you choosing to take with regards to the group? What posture are you taking? Are you jumping in as a participant? Easy. A bit harder, a harvester, collecting for everybody else, or helping to coordinate? Are you jumping in as a host, coordinating the rules, the process, the time of that group? Or are you looking at the longer term stewardship of a project, process, or company? Now, people often confuse these with their LinkedIn profile. In my experience, one of the unlocking blind spots of creative thinking is when a group of people, whether it's a startup or forward-thinking organizations, are able to dissociate these and even reward these more than only the LinkedIn profile, which is very complex to manage actually, because how on earth do you make a salary grid of all these different industry expertises that are of different value because of different industry? When you start rewarding chaotic roles, like this gets a little reward, this gets more, and these get more because of the weight they're carrying with regards to the collective intelligence, you get the basis of a very simple four-leveled organic hierarchy which can rotate, because anybody can become a harvester or host. Usually the idea of this is that you can change host and harvester in different meetings. If you have a process and a template, for example in Miro, then you can actually just jump in and out of being a host and a harvester and not always default to being the person doing all of those at the same time. What we see in practice is usually in startups, the founders, co-founders, CEOs are doing stewardship, hosting, and harvesting, and then they burn out. Whereas they could just get their team to take a harvesting, hosting role, but that requires having a process for different meetings that are regularly run. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. So that 4 levels of hosting collective intelligence is something that we're going to dive into. At one point, I wanted to do an actual online course for this. I had a few people asking me to do a proper deep dive on this. We will be doing something in the future, but I'll take a proper, and this might be something more like a how-to or an online training even around what is the host. We will be looking at also the harvester, which goes with the host. They usually work as a pair, host and harvester. There's some fantastic things out there for learning how to host and harvest. We'll be looking at stewardship as well. The steward is essentially the person who defines purpose, direction, and value rules. And often the value rules are left aside on a slide that nobody reads. So the steward's job is to make sure that the DNA through the value rules is chaotically planted in all the different meetings of the organization. Again, another deep dive we'll do when the time is right. And if you're interested in going further into that, just let me know in the comments below. Fifth and last, I left the best till last. How do you harvest and color code the collective intelligence? Now, if you're a designer, you're guilty like me of color coding everything. If you're visual, you'll probably like color coding your notes. And the question is then, how do you harvest and color code for collective intelligence, not just individual? I've seen so many times meetings where people are either arguing or upset about each other's color coding. What results is a grand mess of color on a post-it board, which is why some people just don't want to use post-its, because it is so chaotic. Now, here's a hack that we found from using way too many post-its, both in paper and in face-to-face. If you think of, I'm going to show you actually the example on my desk, because I have them right here as a harvest right there. So let me show you if I can get the, yeah, you can see my camera. There you go. There are my Chaordic post-its. I have 4 colored post-its always at hand on my desk. And there's a reason for that. I'll show you why. It's a really simple idea. If you, instead of color coding content, were to color code process, this is what happens. You just need 4 colors. Blue would be for individual intelligence. So for example, in a process, you're color coding essentially the maturity of information. So individual is like, for example, my need, my idea, my build to a project if I'm a designer. Green is the collective intelligence, typically what we'd call insights in a workshop. So it's a lot of blues turn into a few clusters of greens. So if you're doing workshops, you know how it is. You do lots of post-its and you start clustering them. Sometimes you vote and you try and get a few simplified titles. Those are the greens. They're like insights, patterns. And this is what we call collective intelligence. That's why it's green. And then you have the yellow, which is one step further from collective insights. It's an idea. So it could be in a brainstorm, you get loads of yellow post-its, which is further down the line, you get from insights to ideas for a solution. For example, if you've got a problem that you're trying to solve, or if it's a design, they're ideas of how to do the design. And then red is where you've actually collectively decided with an owner, a date, a deadline, what is the actual to do based on this. Now, in workshops, what I've seen is that you often have at the end of a workshop, people are tired and they forget to do the red and they confuse the orange and the yellow, and it creates huge conflicts because you'll get a person who says like, oh, but we agreed, didn't we, that we would do this, and that no, this was just an idea. No, I thought it was an agreement. But if you just color code the maturity of the process, you get 2 great outputs. One is that you get much more intelligence from visualizing. You can just see where you are. If I did a sketch here of what it would look like if I'm taking notes on a big wall with post-its, you can have a process that goes, this is the check-in. You start collecting blue post-its. You get clusters of green. Then you get some oranges for ideas. And from then you cluster and you get a few action points in red and you check out with them. That open and close is very commonly used as a mental model for process design. But when you start color coding on that, you start to, with a scan, with a visual glance, to see on a wall of color how mature the process has moved forward. So anybody who steps into the process halfway knows exactly whether the process is ready or not to actually crystallize into action. The other great thing about this is that it drops a big ego and conflict problem around ownership, because on these you really need ownership. On these it's counterproductive, and people often confuse, like, that's why in IDEO they have the rule don't judge, and it doesn't matter whose idea it is and all this kind of thinking, because the ownership here, this is collective ownership. Whereas this, it's my idea, my need, or is more importantly my needs, so that you can backtrack to the person who needs it and fulfill that need. And this is about accountability. If I have a to-do list and nobody's put their name on it, then it's not going to get done. So that and that needs ownership and that doesn't. Once you start understanding that simple 4-point color coding, literally I use it on digital boards now. That's one of my Miro boards, which when I look at this, I know that if I'm just trying to get the to-dos, I'll just pick the red post-it out and that's it. I don't need to think twice. So the color coding in this sense is chaotic. because it colors the process maturity as opposed to the content of what's on the post-it. We used to sell these post-its until the environment started to require that we don't print paper anymore and that we use digital boards, which is a great thing. So now we just use templated Miro boards with those 4 colors. Now, the takeaway from this, the so what, is try using chaotic color coding in anything you do, like take your notes with color or highlight in your Google Docs or whatever you're using to harvest. Try using chaotic color coding when you're working together, because you'll probably find that if you all share that color coding, you're going to, again, make the chaotic balance easier for the collective to tap into collective intelligence. So these were the 5 blind spots. And we will have some follow-up of this in the comments, as I said several times already today. And we are a research organization. So we're doing these videos not as a sort of purely tutorial like some. We're doing this with the intention of interacting and learning ourselves, enriching what we do and sharing it widely. So do share some likes if you liked what we're doing, and also share some experiences. There are going to be some people next week who are going to join and who've got really deep expertise from Sound Games about how this has worked for them. How do they create chaotic balance? Because they're a gaming company. They design games. They need creativity, extreme creativity. They've also had their fair share of conflicts. They've learned how to transform conflicts. There's going to be some really interesting reflections coming from them in the Viking check-in next week. So if you want to join in and ask them questions about practical reality of running a startup with chaotic balance, they'll be more than happy to answer your questions. And before we go, are there any questions that I can pick up from the chat right now? Anna, would you like to ask any questions, or are there none for now? Okay. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Do give me some feedback, praise included if you think it was good. If not, just let me know what could be improved so that we can do the next videos better and better and continue doing this social research with the topic of conscious communication. Thank you very much.